So in this short video, we're going to look at the decisions of firms that are operating in a perfectly competitive market. So I want to start out with the question, would a firm ever operate if it's losing money? And let me draw a graph to help illustrate this point. So suppose that this graph shows dollar amounts, or you think of this as price or average cost on the vertical axis, and the quantity that this firm produces on the horizontal axis. And we'll assume that there is some marginal cost curve, and then we'll have the market price. Remember that firms in perfectly competitive markets are price takers. And I'll draw the average total cost curve, which is above price everywhere. Okay, and I'll quickly mention that the average total cost curve intersects the marginal curve at the minimum average total cost. Okay, the basic idea is that once the marginal cost of the next unit is above the average total cost, it's bringing up the average. Whereas if marginal cost is below the average total cost, which happens to the left of this point here, the marginal cost is lower, so it's bringing down the average. Okay, so the question is, would the firm ever operate? It's losing money on every unit that it sells because the average total cost is greater than the market price. So would it ever operate? Of course, the most obvious answer is no, it would not. But if you allow us to make some assumptions, you actually would get a surprising result. Okay, so to help us see this, let's distinguish between the short run and the long run. In the short run, we will assume that there are fixed costs that are sunk. In the earlier lecture, I suggested that fixed cost may be avoidable. But for the purpose of this part of this lecture, we're going to assume that all fixed costs are sunk. Okay, and so let me draw the average variable cost curve here. I'm going to assume that it is below the price, or at least a portion of it is below the price. Okay, so let's look at it. What would the firm want to do if it were to operate? Of course, it would choose a quantity of output where price is equal to marginal cost. So it would choose this quantity here. That is if it decides to operate at all. And let's think about it. If the fixed costs are sunk, then it's going to lose the fixed costs anyway. And let's see what the fixed costs are on this graph. If we take the difference between the height of the average total cost and the average variable cost curve at this Q star amount, that gives the average fixed cost, or the fixed cost divided by the number of units. If we then multiply that by the number of units sold, that gives the total fixed cost. Okay, so if we were to trace this over here, oops, try to do it a little bit better. Okay. Then we could see that if the firm were not to operate at all, its losses would be equal to the fixed costs, which, as I said, are equal to the difference between the average total cost and the average variable cost times the number of units sold, which is the area of this rectangle here. Okay, so that would be the firm's losses in the short run if they were to shut down and not produce anything. It would just be equal to the fixed costs, which we are assuming are sunk. Now let's look at what its losses are if they do decide to operate. Okay, if they decide to operate, then on each unit that they sell, they're losing the difference between the average total cost curve and price. So this is their loss per unit. If we multiply that by the number of units sold, then we get the total losses. It's the area of this rectangle here. So we can see that the losses, if they operate, still exist. They're still losing money, but they're not losing as much money as they would if they were to shut down entirely. So by operating, even though they're losing money, they're able to recoup some of their losses. Obviously, in the long run, when the fixed costs are avoidable, they wouldn't operate if they're losing money. They would shut down. But in the short run, they can. Okay, so let's think about what that means for the supply curve of a single firm. So I'm going to remove some of those things to try and help make this graph a little bit clearer. If they operate, they're going to choose a quantity of output where price is equal to marginal cost, right? So if this is the market price, if price were to go down a little bit lower, let's say the price were this amount, okay? If they were to operate, they would choose the quantity equal to the horizontal distance of this point, okay? And so on, okay? So the inverse supply curve for this one firm is equal to the marginal cost curve, with one exception. If the price were to drop below the minimum average variable cost, then even in the short run, the firm would want to shut down. Even if you're ignoring fixed costs, then they're losing money per each unit that they sell. And so they would rather not operate at all in that case. So that implies that the inverse supply curve for a given firm is equal to the marginal cost curve that lies above the average variable cost. So it's sort of this green component there. Let me erase this. It's kind of confusing. Okay, let's now think about how we get the overall inverse supply curve for the entire market, not just the inverse supply curve of one firm. So let me draw this graph here. So I'm going to have price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. And I'm going to draw the inverse supply curve for a number of different firms. So we're going to have firm A, firm B, firm C. So here we have firm C doesn't start producing until the price is a little bit higher. Maybe it has higher costs than the other firms. And let's say this is the inverse supply curve for firm D. To get the overall amount supplied in the market, we're going to add the horizontal distance of these individual firm supply curves. So at this point here, or any price below this price, no firm is willing to operate at all, even in the short run. But at that price, suddenly there's two firms that are willing to supply somewhat larger amounts. We're going to add up the horizontal distance of sort of this point here and this point here, and that gives us a point on the overall supply curve in the market. So it sort of increases, it keeps something the horizontal sum of the inverse supply curves for firm B and firm A, up until this point where firm C is now willing to supply. And it starts by supplying an amount that's not close to zero, right? It's going to supply an amount that's equal to the quantity where average variable cost is minimized, which is not necessarily a quantity that's close to zero. So there's going to be sort of this discrete jump up in the quantity produced at that price. And then from there, we're going to see, as price increase further, the total amount supplied in the market is the horizontal sum of the inverse supply curves for firm A, B, and C. Okay, and then obviously once we reach this point here where firm D is willing to operate, there's going to be another discrete jump in the quantity supplied, and then the market inverse supply curve is going to be the horizontal sum of the four firms A, B, C, and D. So I want to clarify one point. Recall that producer surplus is defined as the area below the market price but above the inverse supply curve. And we have covered the fact that the inverse supply curve exists, at least in the short run, in areas where firms are losing money. And so producer surplus can be positive even when profits are negative. And the reason is because in the short run, producer surplus, which is defined by those inverse supply curves, doesn't include the fixed cost component, whereas if we're thinking about the total profits of the firm, that would incorporate the fixed costs. I now want to talk about the difference between the short and the long run. In the short run, firms may operate even when they're losing money. If they can recoup some of their sunk fixed cost losses, they will operate in the short run. And that is why the inverse supply curve for a firm in the short run is the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the minimum average variable cost. In the long run, however, firms will shut down if they're losing money. And therefore, in the long run, the inverse supply curve for a firm is the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the average total cost. Now, although the inverse supply curve for a firm is the portion of the marginal cost curve that lies above the average total cost curve, what we would expect is if the price were somewhat above the minimum average total cost, that other firms would see a profit opportunity and they would enter. And this would sort of drive price down to the point where price is exactly equal to the minimum of the average total cost. If price were below the minimum average total cost, you would expect firms to exit the industry because they're not making any money. So in the long run, as sort of firms exit or enter accordingly, you would expect that price in the market would be equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve. And each firm is producing the quantity which minimizes their average total cost curve. This is more efficient than having a smaller number of firms producing at somewhat higher costs or higher average total cost. Rather, the market sort of adjusts until you have just the right number of firms. So each firm is producing at the minimum of their average total cost curve, which results in the product being produced overall in the market at lowest total cost. I wanted to make one other point. We usually assume that in the long run, firms earn zero profits. But if you look at this graph, it would look like firm A and firm B, which have lower costs, would be able to profit in this market. The reason for this discrepancy is sort of a technical issue. When firms earn profits in perfectly competitive markets, there is some reason why they are earning those profits. Maybe they have lower costs because their location is particularly valuable. Okay? But to earn those profits, they don't actually have to operate. Okay? Instead of operating, they could take this resource which they own, which makes their company earn profits, and they could instead rent out that profit, that resource, or they could sell that resource. Okay, so it has nothing to do with actually operating. It's basically income that they're earning because that firm owns some resource. And therefore, rather than labeling those profits as profits, we're going to call them economic rents. They are rents that are being earned on some resource that is owned by the firm. So technically, because we call those profits something else, the rents, not profits, it holds that firms earn zero profits in perfectly competitive markets, even when some firms have lower costs than others.